It was a crisp morning in the small, peaceful town of Maplewood, where life seemed to flow slowly, and everyone knew each other's name. Nestled in the center of this quaint town was a humble diner, where the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, and the sound of creaky wooden floors accompanied the chatter of locals. It was a place where neighbors gathered to enjoy breakfast, read the paper, and share stories about the weather or the latest happenings in town. At a corner table, Raymond Cooper, a 72-year-old retired Army veteran, sat alone, sipping his black coffee. His jacket, worn thin by time, and his faded jeans showed no signs of luxury. The table before him was modest, with just a small notepad and a black pen neatly placed next to his coffee cup. Raymond was a quiet man who liked to write down thoughts, errands, or any little reminders that came to mind. Despite his reserved nature, there was something warm and welcoming about him. On that particular morning, no one noticed two new figures entering the diner, Officers Harris and Locke, who had recently transferred to Maplewood Police Department. Both officers, dressed in crisp uniforms, exuded an air of authority that some might even consider excessive. They scanned the diner for a moment, and their eyes landed on Raymond, sitting quietly at his table, stirring his coffee. "What's that old guy doing here so early, scribbling in a notepad?" Harris muttered under his breath, nudging his partner Locke. Locke raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk forming at the corner of his mouth. Together, the officers approached the counter, ignoring Nora, the friendly waitress, as she greeted them. After placing their order for black coffee, the officers made their way to a booth near Raymond's table. They sat down, clearly trying to assert themselves, glancing at Raymond from time to time, as if expecting trouble. For a while, they remained silent, content to observe him. Raymond, however, didn't seem to notice. He continued sipping his coffee, jotting down a few words in his notepad every now and then. Eventually, Harris leaned over and called out to him in a tone that lacked any warmth. "Morning," he said. "Looks like you're busy, old-timer." Raymond looked up from his writing, offering a polite nod. "Good morning, officer," he replied softly, setting his pen down. He gave them a small, respectful smile, kind yet reserved. Locke eyed Raymond's worn jacket, his scuffed shoes, and the crumpled notepad on the table. "Haven't seen you around," he remarked, his voice laced with suspicion. "You live here?" Raymond paused for a moment, weighing his words carefully. "I've lived in Maplewood for about a decade," he said calmly. "Retired here." "Retired, huh?" Harris frowned, eyeing him closely. "Mind if we ask from what line of work?" Raymond could feel the weight of their questioning, but he knew it wasn't right to dignify the insinuations. He simply answered, "Army," with a steady gaze. Harris and Locke exchanged quick glances. Something about Raymond, his quiet demeanor, his calm presence, seemed to rub them the wrong way. Maybe they expected him to be more forthcoming, or maybe they just didn't like that he responded with such composure. "Army," Locke repeated, a laugh escaping him. "Sure doesn't look like you had a big pension." His eyes flicked to Raymond's worn shoes and the second-hand jacket he wore. Raymond didn't flinch, just taking a slow sip of his coffee. "I get by," he said quietly. But Harris wasn't done. "Sometimes we see people pretending to be veterans," he remarked. "Fooling folks for discounts or respect. You one of those guys?" The air in the diner grew still. Nearby patrons glanced over, sensing the tension that was building. Nora, wiping down a counter, shot Raymond a worried look. She knew him well enough to know he was a kind soul who never caused trouble. Raymond's jaw tightened slightly. He had faced disrespect before, but it never made it any easier. "I don't pretend anything," he replied softly. "I served. That's all." Locke scoffed. "If you served, where's your proof?" He waved a hand dismissively. "We got a lot of phonies around here. Stolen valor's no joke." Raymond didn't respond right away. He let the insinuations hang in the air, before calmly reaching for his wallet. He opened it and retrieved a small, worn VA identification card, which he slid across the table toward the officers. Locke picked it up, scrutinizing it with a skeptical glare. Harris leaned over to take a closer look. They exchanged a glance, neither of them convinced. Harris flicked the card back across the table. "Looks fake," he muttered, dismissing it. A few nearby diners exchanged glances, some with pity in their eyes, others just curious. Yet no one intervened. Maplewood was a small town, and most people knew better than to challenge the police. The officers were new, but their badges still carried weight. Raymond's expression remained calm, but a flicker of hurt crossed his eyes. "I have no need to lie," he said quietly. "I served. End of story." Locke chuckled, sipping his coffee. Well, maybe you're one of those vets who got dishonorably discharged, he said. That could explain a lot. The comment stung. Raymond took a slow breath, choosing not to dignify it with a response. He simply shook his head. His silence seemed to egg them on. Harris sneered. Wearing that jacket, pretending you served with honor. People like you make me sick. He pointed to the notepad on Raymond's table. Writing a sob story? Maybe scamming folks for donations. Raymond met his gaze, his shoulders squared. I'm just jotting things down for my day, he said calmly. No scams here. Locke crossed his arms, a smug look on his face. Why don't you leave, he sneered. This place doesn't need your type lurking around and making customers uncomfortable. Raymond stiffened. I'm not bothering anyone, he said firmly. I have the right to have coffee wherever I please. Harris stood up, towering over him. You better watch your tone, he growled. We could toss you out of here for causing a disturbance. Raymond looked around. No one seemed willing to stand up for him. He briefly considered walking out to avoid further humiliation, but something inside him refused to give in to their bullying. After all, he had served his country. He wouldn't let them intimidate him. The tension escalated as Harris reached out, grabbing the front of Raymond's jacket. Let's see if you're hiding anything suspicious, he muttered, patting him down. Raymond's heart raced, but he didn't resist. Nothing but old bones, Locke joked. Just then, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform stepped inside. Captain Braxton of the Maplewood Police Department. The crowd parted as he walked in, his gaze sweeping over the room. When his eyes landed on Harris and Locke, who were still hassling Raymond, his expression shifted. He strode toward them with purpose, his voice booming with authority. What's going on here? He demanded. Harris froze, still gripping Raymond's jacket. Locke quickly straightened up, dropping his smug posture. We were just, investigating a suspicious individual, sir, Harris stammered. Suspicious? Braxton echoed, his tone cold with disbelief. He recognized Raymond. How could he not? Maplewood was small, and certain stories had made their way through the town. The captain turned his full attention to Raymond, who stood tall despite the indignity of the situation. He claims to be a veteran, sir, Locke said, his voice wavering. But we're not convinced. He just seems out of place. Might be a phony. Captain Braxton silenced him with a single, piercing look. His gaze shifted to the notepad on the table, but something else caught his eye, a small plaque, partially hidden under the notepad. He reached over and picked it up, turning it in his hands. It was an old but well-polished service plaque. It read, Raymond Cooper, Staff Sergeant, Purple Heart recipient. Braxton's eyes widened slightly as he recognized the significance. He turned the plaque over, reading the inscription that detailed Raymond's gallantry in Vietnam, a reminder of the sacrifices made so many years ago. Harris and Locke exchanged panicked glances. They had misjudged him, and now they knew it. Captain Braxton set the plaque down gently before turning to Raymond. Sergeant Cooper, he said, his voice thick with respect. I'm deeply sorry to see you treated this way. Harris stammered, Captain, we didn't know. Braxton's voice grew stern. But you made no effort to find out, did you? Instead, you presumed guilt. Turning to Raymond, he added, I apologize on behalf of this department. We owe you better. Raymond nodded, his eyes reflecting a mix of relief and lingering anger. I appreciate that, Captain, he said softly. I just came here for coffee. A tense silence followed before Nora, the waitress, approached with a fresh cup of coffee, offering it on the house. I'm so sorry, she whispered, her eyes glistening. You deserve more respect than that. Raymond gave her a small, polite smile. I've faced worse, he murmured, though his hands still trembled slightly. Outside, the sounds of muffled shouting signaled a heated conversation between Captain Braxton and the two officers. The other patrons exchanged knowing glances, silently waiting for what would happen next. Eventually, Braxton returned alone. His face was grim, and he walked over to Raymond. Mr. Cooper, he said quietly, I've addressed the incident. Those two officers will face disciplinary action. My sincerest apologies again. Raymond accepted the apology with a nod. I appreciate it, Captain. I never wanted a scene. Braxton nodded in return. I know. You've always been a humble man. He placed a hand gently on Raymond's shoulder. If you need anything, don't hesitate to let us know. With that, he left, and Raymond was once again left alone in his peaceful corner. The diner's atmosphere slowly returned to normal as the chatter resumed. Several patrons approached Raymond, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service. Raymond smiled politely, though he preferred not to dwell on the attention. He simply wanted to finish his coffee and go about his day. As he gathered his belongings to leave, Nora stepped forward again, urging him to stay. "Please, stay and finish your breakfast on the house," she insisted. "We insist, Mr. Cooper." Raymond gently patted her hand. "Thank you, but I've got errands to run," he said, slipping on his jacket and tucking the plaque carefully under his arm. As he glanced around, he saw empathy in the eyes of the diners. The hostility from earlier had dissolved, replaced by a collective sense that an injustice had been corrected. Stepping outside, Raymond inhaled the crisp air, feeling the weight of the moment lift from his shoulders. He thought about those officers. Sure, they held authority, but they lacked humility. He hoped they'd learn something from this encounter, about respect, about service, and about not rushing to judgment. As Raymond walked down Maplewood's main street, he reflected on the tests life had thrown at him over the years. He had faced battlefields, heartbreak, and harshness. A diner scuffle with arrogant officers was but a small bump in his long journey. He was headed home, his mind already drifting to peaceful thoughts, the satisfaction of having stood his ground once again.